Hi, good morning. My name is Jonathan Meronek with SCS Engineers. Thank you for joining us here today. Big thank you to John and WGR Southwest for inviting us here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about our recent developments and emerging trends in stormwater regulation, and that will be our industrial track today. So thank you very much. I've been with SCS for about 16 years. I'm currently the person in charge of stormwater for California, although we have dischargers and permittees in other states as well. So let's just get right to it, shall we? So today's overview, just a real quick overview. We have first the Clean Water Act. We'll do a quick review and NPDES regulations. Then we'll go into a quick review of a landmark settlement. And that'll show kind of some upcoming regulations and what to look out for in the future. And in that scenario, we have a tiered escalation response, and that's a potential glimpse into the future. And we'll look at 3 states. We'll look at California, Washington, and Oregon, and how they're presently dealing with the tiered escalation response for industrial permittees and dischargers. We will also take a quick look at ERA Level 2 responses and kind of a quick walkthrough with a typical MRF and transfer center and how they're dealing with it on boots on the ground and management. And then we'll peel back from 35,000 feet and look down and say, here's some of the lessons we've learned so far going forward, and then a closing and look to the future. So really, we've all seen this picture just about, and as you know, river's on fire, right? The Cuyahoga River on fire, burning, and really was the impetus and pushed forward Congress framing the Clean Water Act in 1972. So the purpose of the Clean Water Act, just a refresher, is to restore and maintain chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's water systems. So to that end, and under the Clean Water Act, stormwater runoff cannot occur unless an NPDES permit or a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit is in place. We look at both federal quickly and then state regulations. On November 16th of 1990, the U.S. promulgated Phase 1 Stormwater Acts in compliance with Section 402 of the Clean Water Act, and really cemented it in from there and moving forward. So as we know, under the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, we have several types of permits. We could have large and medium MS4 or municipal separate storm sewer systems, small MS4 programs. We have construction activities. We also have residual designations that could be a separate facility. And then for today's discussion, we'll be talking about industrial activities under our industrial general permit. So at the federal level, we'll start there. It's a multi-sector general permit, or the MSGP. And this permit is in place. Approximately 48 states now have primacy, which means those states are responsible for their own water quality laws as they're promulgated down from the federal level. On other locations that the MSGP may apply is individual state areas, tribal lands, U.S. territories, and even some federal facilities. So that being said, right, a little while ago in 2016, so the United States EPA, the EPA entered into a landmark settlement with the Waterkeeper Alliance. So the Waterkeeper Alliance is a large NGO group, very respectful and has some teeth to it. I believe it was founded by Robert Kennedy. And in this case, they came forward and said, look, under the multi-sector general permit, currently, we don't think it does enough to protect water quality in the United States. So that being said, as this decision moves forward, it has major implications on the multi-sector general permit on the federal level, and then the general permits, right, of each state that has primacy must not be less stringent than the EPA's multi-sector general permit. So in this settlement, what the EPA must do when they move forward with the 2020 multi-sector general permit, they must include tiered response actions. So tiered response actions, they also must put forward a National Resource Council study, and that will be to look at certain issues pertinent to the next multi-sector general permit. That fund is approximately $250,000, and we expect to see those studies begin to come out early next year. There's also some other requirements sprinkled within that settlement, like coal tar sealants, and also some eligibility requirements for current facilities or surplus sites. We will look at the tiered response out of those settlements, and when you look at California, Washington, and Oregon, we all have a tiered response mechanism. So are these potential precursors, or can we start to look at what might happen in the future to the other states that have primacy and what to expect in the next decade? So real quick, the escalation scenario or three-tier risk level system. So based on stormwater analytical results, right, you come out at the baseline level. So we'll start at the baseline. You'll take your samples for the first stormwater reporting year. After that, based on those stormwater chemistry samples, you'll compare those to EPA or state benchmarks. And if you exceed the benchmarks, which in our case in California are numeric action limits, you will escalate to an ERA level 1 based on some certain parameters and requirements, including yearly average or, in fact, maybe an instantaneous maximum. So as you look at that, you'll go into your next reporting year. If you exceed them again, you go to level 2. I'll just say this, level 2 is not the Platinum Club. It's not the place that we want to be. We'd rather stay down here in the basement, right? Kind of mind our own business, not have a high profile, and not be on ERA level 2 or the highest parameter. So again, if we look at this, reporting year 1, to me, when it starts and you know you might have an ERA level 1 problem, it's almost like the clock is ticking. You know, what can you do? What source control can you employ? What can you do as far as minimum, advanced, and other BMPs to get your site? So get your site ready. So we look at our reporting year number 1. Number 2, the facility year moves to ERA level 2, and then reporting year 3. So again, as I said, so Washington, Oregon, and California already have some type of this exceedance response action mechanism in place. The state of Washington, or the Department of Ecology, has already put their permit in place, and it's a 3-level approach for corrective actions or further implementation of your BMPs. So in this scenario, by the way, is more explicit than the California permit. Ours are more general. This one actually is a little more explicit in what you do in your tiered response. So in level 1, we got corrective actions by way of operational source control BMPs. Level 2 may contain structural source controls. And level 3, treatment control BMPs up into including active treatment systems. So in Oregon, it's just a recent 1200Z general permit. Also has a built-in tiered risk level set of actions for impairment pollutants and benchmark exceedances. Here we have a quick look at some of the benchmark exceedances in California, Washington, and Oregon. You'll see that some commonalities in some of the parameters and constituents of concern, but then there's also some other ranges that are a little bit different and based on either physical characteristics of the watershed or other items, including stakeholder input and or political items, they do change and have some fluctuation. So that being said, here in California, and for today, the remainder of today, we're going to focus on potential precursors and what we've experienced in California, right? So as we know, the current permit, the current industrial general permit, which is our third one, right? 1991, 1997, and then our next one that was adopted on April 1st of 2014, brought into full effect on July 1st of 2015. So that being said, now if our stormwater reporting year or our stormwater fiscal year goes from July 1st to June 30th, we're currently in our 4th year. So we've just started our 4th year. So we've also felt the trials and tribulations and some of those growing pains as we've come into this exceedance response mechanism and model. So that being said, you know, it's worth looking back, and we know that the permitting process was a long one for this permit since the '97 permit. They're roughly renewed every 5 years. To the board's credit, they put a lot of work into this and listened to a lot of stakeholder input. Sometimes it seemed like much longer than they could or should have, but it was a good, solid effort coming into the July 1st of 2015 reporting year. So we'll look at a couple of the benchmarks here. So we do have an additional column on this side, and that's for your instantaneous maximum. All those other constituents concerned, your typical ones, pH, oil and grease, TSS, and then we're going to go into some SIC code ones of some metals, maybe COD, other constituents of concern. All of those are yearly averages. For our top three, right, pH, TSS, and oil and grease, they have two standards or benchmarks as these numeric action limits of what they're judged. So the range of pH 6.0 to 9.0, we have total suspended solids. On the lower level, on a yearly average, it's 100 milligrams per liter or parts per million, and then an instantaneous maximum. Instantaneous maximum, by the way, is not a perfect term because it's actually if it happens twice. So it could be an event, could be a different qualifying storm events, but it's important to keep that in mind. And then of course, oil and grease, you have a lower benchmark of 15 for the yearly average, and then we also have 25 milligrams per liter for the upper part of the instantaneous maximum. So a little thought and a little bit of discussion regarding the exceedance response actions under NALs or numeric action limits. Simply put, they're the EPA benchmarks our California state permit has put forward to compare your analytical results of your constituents of concern. So it's not intended to purely serve as a technology-based or water quality numeric effluent limitations. And we know from the stakeholder input early on, right, that there was a lot of talk of perhaps effluent limits. So if you break an effluent limit, you essentially broke the permit, but with a numeric action limit, you don't break the permit unless you do not follow the prescribed method to implement further your BMPs and to stay on track as the industrial general permit requires. So that being said, if a discharger that does not fully comply with the ERA level 1 or level 2 status, then they're in a violation of the general permit. So very important there. And if it's a violation of the general permit, it's a violation of the Clean Water Act. So as we said, we were administratively brought forth in April of 2014 to be fully adopted and live on July 1st of 2015. We started there. Then you take your sampling, your NALs, you'd compare them to, then it would trigger, if you were over them, you go into ERA level 1. Then through that reporting year, you could go to ERA level 2 for the following year. So that's where we're at. So this being the 4th year, at the 3rd level, we're going to see in a slide or two here that you have to put in place, first of all, for the ERA action, for the ERA report, you have to have a QISP, a qualified industrial stormwater professional, visit the site and do a walkthrough by October 1st of that year. Then by January 1st, on or before, by the next year, you have to have a report in place for either an ERA level 1, next up is an ERA level 2, where many sites last year had ERA level 2 action plans in place, and now coming up on January 1st of 19 is our due date, on or before, that we have to prepare an ERA level 2 technical report. So a quick look from the Water Board. This is a little outdated, courtesy of the Water Board and California Stormwater Quality Association's conference. This is from August of 2017. As we know, we have 9 regional water quality boards that fight the good fight on the front line to keep us in compliance, and it stretches this through the state of California. So the first year going forward, we know that of approximately 9,000 dischargers with required reporting, and now I believe we're up to somewhere in the neighborhood of 12,000, which means we have 10,000 NOI dischargers and approximately 2,000 NECs. I still believe there's only about 200 NONAs or of that sort. So of those sites that first year that took analytical samples, that actually took samples, and not all of them did, 3,100 facilities became ERA level 1. After that, for the immediate following year and subsequent time, approximately 1,000 facilities went into ERA level 2. Just this week, and thank you for the board for giving me this, Patrick and his crew, as of September 2018, right now, as it stands, we have approximately 2,118 active dischargers or permittees with a live WDID, and they are at least at level 1 for one or more pollutant of concern. We have 1,232 active dischargers with WDIDs with one or more level 2 parameters. And of these sites with exceedances above, we have 635 WDID dischargers that are both a combination of level 1 and level 2 parameters. For those of you that are not consultants in the discharges, remember that it's per constituent of concern or per pollutant, right? So very typically you could be baseline for pH, you could be ERA level 1 for TSS, and you could be level 2 for perhaps oil and grease, iron, aluminum, zinc, lead, any one of those constituents of concern. So it gets a little confusing too, and you have to keep ahead of it. And also in SMARTS, you can look at the requirements tab. The caveat there is SMARTS is not infallible, and if you look at it and it says you're ERA level 1, you better darn well go back and look at your analytical results for that stormwater reporting year, compare it again and make sure everything's right. If it says you're at baseline, that doesn't mean you're at baseline. There might be a little glitch in SMARTS. So double check your analytical parameters again and make sure they're right. Don't rely on that. So what does this tiered approach to stormwater look like going through California? We're going to just quickly look at a current facility we have. It's about an approximate 1 acre site. It's a MRF or materially recover facility and recycler. We have an SIC code of 5093. Certainly has some historic issues, right? As many in that SIC battle that. We have very, very heavy traffic there, also typical, and a high runoff curve, right? It's almost 100% impervious. Rooftops, concrete, asphalt concrete, and other. We'll just give it a runoff curve of 98. So we have 2 drainage areas. One light, which is a liquid natural gas fueling area, and we also have a heavier side with the transfer center, also some maintenance areas. Luckily, the majority of the maintenance area goes directly to sanitary sewer. Looking at some old benchmarks, I'll just say the yellow is the exceedances. So obviously coming out, we had some difficulties, even under the dates of the old permit. As we move forward, we took a little additional look at this site, divided up into some areas to see what we could do as far as BNPs and what items were within the site. So some of the conclusions real quickly, we just knew that there was high total metals, concentrations over numeric action limits. The COD was all over the place. That was the one thing that we could not hold constant based on deliveries, based on truck traffic, based on the loads and things. That was a hard one. pH has always generally been within range. And of course we saw the maintenance area, right? The maintenance area was going to sanitary sewer. So that area we're good with the oil and grease. So we started at baseline, had some lingering issues that probably weren't addressed under the old permit. It's about the time that we came in. And then we moved, we went above some NALs that triggered an ERA level 1 status. So that level 1 status, really, what are you doing? What kind of arrows do you have in your quiver to go forward? So at that time, really, in terms of feasibility, you want to look at policies, procedures, and prohibitions, right? Non-structural BMPs. What can we do for source control? Can we say, don't do this outside when it's raining? Can we bring some things inside? Can we cover some additional areas for structural BMPs? What can we do without getting too far down the rabbit hole of some advanced BMPs? So then we go into July 1st, 2016. We filed our annual report in June before that, and now we become an ERA level 1. We're going to review the site activities. One of the things I found very, very, very important, and whether you do it or one of your staff, or if you're a discharger, one of your staff and the consultant perhaps, asked the boots on the ground personnel, the people that were there during the sampling or during the year, did anything happen or did anything change? You know, I've had sites that I've personally observed sheen, and it didn't seem like it fit the site, and I went up gradient or went up upstream and found out that a hydraulic hose broke on a cat loader. So that was a big deal that day, and we wanted to write it up as a potential exception and know that that happened. Other than that, you also want to make sure that they're sampling in the exact right place. We had a facility in Benicia that they weren't really paying attention to the site map, and then when we went and really dug in and went on a site walk with them, we found out that it was one more DI over, and it actually had contribution from a former storage area that was mostly rebar and old rusty equipment. So that one definitely was indicative of the small maintenance area, but it was still downgradient enough that commingled to both sites. So it's a great thing to look at with your boots on the ground personnel, and it's a good place to start. So you re-review the data, right? And then you look logically what could be causing these. In this specific attack, right? To me, it's know your enemy. It's the art of war, right? So what are we looking at here? We're looking at metals exceedances, TSS overages, and what can we do to bring those down? So again, the tiered approach. We did realize that there could be possibly some dissolved metals, and we might want to do a particulate analysis, right? First and foremost, we're thinking that TSS could be tied to the metals, but there's other things that we had to look at as well. So that being said, our definite improvement was in some areas with minimum and additional BMPs. Believe it or not, even hand sweeping around bollards and things right before they do the sweep back truck actually seemed like visually those observations had improved somewhat. For a typical MRF or a transfer center in this situation, we know that a good portion of it is particulate, and hopefully it has a little bit of a relationship with TSS. So that's what we looked at pretty strong. At that point, we did not get to further characterization of the stormwater quality though. We were looking at what we could do to eliminate the TSS first and then potentially the metals second. So then we increased the frequency of regenerative vac sweeping. We also tried REM Triton filters. Those worked fairly well, but in some of the qualifying storm events, we noticed that they were getting overtopped, and perhaps it wasn't a full drainage survey. And based on some very easy back of the napkin calcs, I think that they were overrun by some heavier areas of discharge. Intermediate BMP, we also went with some soap socks and metal locks, which actually showed significant improvement, and that helped also. So these are all kind of your low-cost intermediate BMPs that you really want to try these first if you can, and you have the location and the discharge areas to do that in your drainage management area, and see if those can help. So based on that, going into our next year, what else can we look at? This shows here, we went ahead and graphed it out. So you have your concentrations of metals and nitrate on your parts per million on the left Y, and then your concentrations of TSS on the right Y. So that being said, and the dates on your x-axis, looking at a grab sample, right? It's a point and it's a sample, a point in space and time, and not always perfectly indicative, but it's what we have. So when you look at the dates and you look at the measurements of the metals, and the TSS is the black dotted line, the metals are the red, yellow, and green line. Those metals, as constituents of concern, do show some correlation of metals versus TSS. So logical link, right? We look at it and we say, I bet you that if we can knock the TSS down, we can knock the metals down. So that being said, that's what we did. Revised the SWIP, certified accordingly, added additional BMPs, identified in our level 1 evaluation. And by the way, you generally don't want to wait till January 1st. You want to get those in, because if you have some analytical results that are below, it's not triggered till after that date, as I understand it. So then you'd have the QISP or a QISP trainer of record like us, we'd certify that and say, here's our evaluation summary, here's what we saw, and here's what we're going to do, and our first step and intermediate step going towards reducing and or eliminating pollutants of concern in stormwater. So here we go. We are at baseline July 1st of 2016 after the annual report. We enter into level 1 status. We did some extra things. July 1st, 2017, we worked diligently. We started characterizing the stormwater chemistry, and we started really having to take a look at it. So again, our thought was, if we can reduce those the TSS enough, we can maybe get those metals down. And what you're going to see here is with the installation of the hydrodynamic dual vortex separator, we found that the TSS did drop out, and we got some good results. However, we got to a law of diminishing returns. The iron, the aluminum, and zinc were high enough that it wasn't all particulate. So that means we're going to move into a dissolved. And when you hear dissolved, generally speaking, start to talk about active treatment system, right? And we know how expensive that goes. So let's look back at the ERA level 2 reporting schema. The level 2 ERA action plan requires a discharger to propose actions necessary to complete the level 2 ERA technical report and the demonstrations the discharger has selected. We know that we have basically door number 1, door number 2, and door number 3. 3 options, right, for going down the ERA level 2. And what demonstrations we're going to use. And also the board recognizes there may be a combination of those, and you may not know them all until you do further characterizations, investigations, maybe some additional water quality chemistry analysis. But you want to look at this as a whole going into your ERA level 2 action plan. Now remember, the action plan comes on January 1st of the first year after you go to that level, and then 1 year later on January 1st, on or by it, you want to have the technical report which supports your action plan and what you found. So without going too far down any of these rabbit holes, door number 1, door number 2, and door number 3 are basically a non-industrial pollutant source demonstration. You know, where is it coming from? It may not be coming from us, or it's non-industrial. It could be atmospheric deposition. I'm under a large overpass in LA with traffic 24/7, just about, with perhaps natural background pollutant source is more of a, what would you say, a scholarly or a academic review to say that up gradient there is nothing that is man-made or that man has done to the or erosion, sediment control, anything like that man has been involved with. Can you say that it's purely natural background source? That being said, if you look at both of those, if you have anything on your site that might be causing or contributing pollutants to stormwater, either one of those is unequivocally hard to uncommingle, and the cost of doing so may prohibit you to doing either one of those, especially the first one if it's commingled, because it has to be solely attributable. Solely attributable. So that being said, sometimes, and most of the time, the best option is the industrial activity BMP's demonstration. You're saying, yeah, part of it might be from off-site, or it might be some other source, but look, it's on our site, and now we're going to have to choose this and try to get our NALs back down to baseline. So that being said, right, door number 3, this one is the only one, if you can do it and you get your 4 subsequent events below the NALs, that is the only one that you return to baseline. If you do not, the other 2 options, the natural pollutant background demonstration or the non-industrial source, either one of those is still going to put you in ERA 2 for perpetuity. And I don't know if you remember, but Greg Gerhardt coined it almost 5 years ago at our California Stormwater meeting in South Lake Tahoe, and or in North Lake Tahoe. I'll never forget it. He called it ERA level 2 purgatory. And it is somewhere that you do not want to be. So one of the things we're going to look at now is, what's my exposure, or what happens if I become ERA level 2 and I can't get through that? And here's some of our lessons learned today. So one thing, and I think that first year it was BNSF Railroad that came out and they said, look, this permit came out pretty quick and we were not 100% prepared, but we did not have 100% grip on it, and we have some budget constraints there. And that was a pretty big deal, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Then our other options on the table. Is there any way that a NONA, or a notice of non-applicability, could be involved? And we've heard some really good talks on that in the past, and that's sometime an option. We know there's not very many of them. Our two options there, as I understand them, are only if we're not hydraulically connected, or if we can have a PE, a California licensed PE, stamp a set of drawings that says we will not discharge, modeled and based on the largest series of historical storm events for that year. That's a pretty high bar and pretty hard to get, right? So your next option might be, can I get things inside? Can I perhaps get closer to a non-exposure? It's a good point to mention too, for the MRF and Transfer Center and that small site, early on we looked at it, and there was two buildings with some large roof overhangs, and they brought in someone to look at perhaps covering the corridor and the areas in between there. That roof was about $150,000. to get it in and to cover both of them. There was enough structural integrity that they could have just bridged the roof in the most serious area. At that point, it seemed infeasible, and it seemed too expensive at the time, right? And here we are moving up through the ERA level 1, level 2. Next thing, we got a hydrodynamic separator go in. By the time permitting is finished, they drop the box in a small, hard to fit location at the final discharge location before it goes to the city MS4. That was difficult, and about $60K. Well, I'll tell you what, we're at an active treatment system that is about $450,000, and the only media, the activated alumina, perlite, GAC, or granule activated carbon mix, that's going to be about $40,000 of O&M a year. So I'm just saying that if you're a discharger, in the grand scheme of things, think of, how could I really be hurt by this, and what's my exposure? And then the cost to comply, what can I put inside? What can I do? I have an electronics recycler in the East Bay that has determined that his best option is moving his operations to Texas, and they're doing that in the next 6 months. So, what's the feasibility and what are the constraints? Lastly, I will say this. Let me see if I can move this. I might be stuck here. I might have to go to the arrow. There we go. So another item that happened to me in the last year or so is, and I'll fall on the grenade a little bit here, I went into a meeting late, and they brought me aboard to take a look at some things, and I got to the site. There was a couple people there, and there was an MS4 regulator and some other people, and they were talking. I had already taken the day and read through the SWIP and checked everything out, looked pretty good. As I sat there, I realized that I had made a mistake the day before and did not ask that discharger exactly it was what they did. I thought, and I assumed by seeing the SWIP and knowing the site, and although I had never visited it, that I knew what that site was all about. The woman asked the gentleman, the discharger and owner, he said, so what do you do here? He says, well, we're like Hertz. We rent cranes. And I'm flipping through my SWIP, and I was like, that doesn't look like an SIC code. That is a rental. That's a crane manufacturer, which of course would be an industrial general permit. That being said, we had a very good discussion. We talked to Region 2. We had them visit. We went through it all. We talked to the State Water Board. Everybody had a really decent and pragmatic approach. They actually had some things that they wanted to bring inside. Here we were sampling and had a slight zinc exceedance a year or two before that from the other consultant, but not us. And we thought, okay, I think this looks pretty good. And sure enough, we changed the SIC code, which then allowed them to go in and say we're not in the permit as the SIC code. So that just shows that it could be just about anything, and I implore you and encourage you to make sure that that's right. SIC codes, as we know it, are also hard to find. It's kind of an archaic, and if you look to that 87 manual, that's a little bit archaic, and it's hard to say. What do we do? What is the primary economic activity? I know that many of the QISPs, and that was one of the things that was driven home early to look at the SIC codes, and they may not always be right. The person who gave it to you might not even know. The COO might not even know. So, generally look at the form 300A in OSHA or look at something else, but make sure it's right. So what do? You stay flexible and stay involved. have some skin in the game and be part of it. Look at your options with an approach feasibility, right? And keep going and keep knowing your BMPs. Seek data and seek data often. In the grand scheme of things, in that MRF scenario I told about, water chemistry testing and that kind of testing is relatively cheap, especially analytical. And if you got somebody who's doing it at your site or boots on the ground, if you're testing for metals and you think there might be dissolved, have a separate chain and run it through for dissolved. Check and see what your enemy is. Know your enemy, and maybe do some additional homework to get your water quality characterization up front before you look at all your BMPs. I also say this, that there are more BMPs out there than ever before. The cost of a discharger to be involved in this permit is significant, and the research and development by the BMP manufacturers, the testers, all of that, they've come a long way, and they're starting to offer some better solutions at perhaps some lesser prices and maybe better management options. So that's a good thing to know. If anybody has any questions about additional BMPs or databases, feel free to reach out to John or myself. We have a huge arsenal and a lot of arrows in our quiver in that regard. So if needed, and we just heard that yesterday, right? We know that the Water Board has they're going to have the new draft in soon for the TMDLs, sufficiently sensitive test methods, then also the collaboration of areas to have less discharge in retention ponds. So stay educated, stay involved with business associations and water quality associations, and that goes for us, right, as consultants, and it also goes for dischargers. We spoke a little bit to that in the SIC code, and I'll just say this. So at the end of that, I'll just implore you, and look at in feasibility terms only. If you're looking at this, and we know our enemy as far as constituents of concern on the site, and we're characterizing it, in the grand scheme of things, again, it's not the Water Board. They're there to help and be pragmatic and help you through this. And to their credit, they've done an extraordinary job. But really, your bigger exposure is the NGOs. And any one of us consultants, we've almost all seen Mr. Rosenbaum, a fellow Tor and an attorney, give those statistics, right? I think last year there was over 200 NGO lawsuits. That our friends at Brodsky and Smith were a good portion of that, but it is something to be concerned with. We're dealing with a public database. You can search ERA level 1 and ERA level 2 that essentially shortlists dischargers that have not either fully implemented BMPs or are still over their NALs for another reason. Well, that shortlist, they can look at that, and maybe that's where you go, where they go after next. Anybody with a pair of pajamas and an iPad can look at smarts and look at a facility, get on Google Earth and look at your facility from the outside. So it's somewhere you don't want to be. As far as the bigger picture, again at 35,000 feet, right? So we know that the Waterkeeper Alliance and the EPA have come together for this multi-sector general permit, and there's going to be additional responsibility and onuses on dischargers across the United States. The coal tar sealant element, you pretty much want to know if somebody's going to do capital expenditure and seal a parking lot of an industrial facility. You want to know that a couple of years ahead of time, because if you don't and then you use that and somehow you get disqualified, that's a good thing to look at. So we really want to keep an eye on that when you see the drafts of the 2020 multi-sector general permit come out. So that's something to really keep an eye on. So get out front early, constantly reevaluate analytical results versus NALs. Any one of us consultants know that the first time, if somehow you weren't at the site during the year collecting the samples, which you may not have been, really where you're starting in the ERA process is that annual comprehensive facility compliance evaluation. That's in May or June. You want to start right there, getting ready for your October 1st visit if it's in ERA level 2, or finding out what the facts are and where you're at in regards to the ERA level 2 in between the action plan and the technical report. So that being said, we'll move on to the end, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So thank you.
All right.
Any questions?